Could you let me know in 6 minutes? So Bob and I have to run right after we speak. We're going to the Extinction Rebellion action at the water. We're doing peacekeeping there, so thank you, Jonathan, for moving us up so we could do this. So I guess I just want to start by saying something I feel I really need to say. My wife and I were delegates at the Democratic Convention a couple weeks ago, and we listened to 6 hours of speeches from politicians and other people. Not one mention, not one in 6 hours of speeches about the war in Iraq and the war in Afghanistan, the war economy, the military-industrial complex, or the budget. Not 1 minute was spent for that. So we have 18 years of war. 18 years of war. The longest war in U.S. history. And I gotta say, folks, what the fuck? There is nobody talking about it. There is nobody on the streets about it. There is no protests about it. We have spent $6 trillion in those 18 years. $6 trillion. What can we do here at home with $6 trillion? And please don't tell me we could increase the tax breaks for the rich. So the 2020 defense budget was $738 billion. The Veterans Administration, which includes the VA healthcare system, was $217 billion. It's almost $1 trillion, folks, that we're spending every year to be able to fight wars and to deal with part of the cost of war, which is the human cost. As a Vietnam veteran, we can both speak to that. I'm gonna let Bob speak to the big three. I'll nibble around the edges. But we spend more than the next 7 countries combined, including Russia and China, on our defense budget, right? That makes a lot of money for a lot of people. But my wife, I'm not gonna preach to the choir. My wife asked me not to rant, so I'm not going to. But Bob and I'll address spending on veterans and from the savings introduced by the Moral Budget and the Poor People's Campaign. Like I said, Bob will talk about the big three. I'll nibble around the edges. I don't have the numbers and the budget. That's not my pay grade, somebody else's. I'll just talk as a veteran. The first thing we need for our veterans coming home. Now these are people that were forgotten for 18 years. There are people deployed now that weren't even born when that war started. Think about that. That's our kids and our grandkids fighting in a war that has not helped the Middle East at all. It has not made us safer, has not made less okay, I'm not gonna rant, I'm sorry. So, one of the biggest things about coming back from a war, and one of the biggest things for veterans, is jobs. Jobs handle a lot of problems for us. Homelessness, divorce, self-worth, right? So I'm just going to give you an example. You have a sergeant that was 11 Bravo infantry. This is a guy that saved people's lives on a daily basis, made life and death decisions on a daily basis, handling men, counseling men, and logistics, and he comes back and what? What does he train for in civilian life? McDonald's? Think about that. We need to train these people. We need to help them get viable jobs. Childcare. For people deployed, vets disabled, working vets, Homeless vets, there's homeless vets with children. What about childcare for them and vets seeking jobs? Youth training and education. Increase the spending on youth programs, education, vocational, and job training for poor youth. Because that is our draft today. It's the poverty draft. It's not a draft for everybody. Middle class, upper class, they're no longer part of the draft. It's all the poor people looking for a way to go to college. So get those people jobs and training so they don't have to do that. Increase funding to state, city, and university veterans service organizations, our VSOs, so they can help veterans find the benefits that are out there for them, help them find homes and services that are there for them. Defund our military police, our militarization of the police force. Do we need armored vehicles for our protests? We don't need those in the United States. Increase soldiers' homes, increase the number of soldiers' homes, increase the number of beds, rooms, and dormitories, and facilities for long-term care for veterans. Increase addiction treatment centers. A lot of us self-medicated PTSD when we got back from war. My time's up. I'm sorry, turned it over to my brother, Bob Knapp.
I've said I'll follow Dan anywhere, even to the next thing we're going to. I just want to say, most people in Boston know my identity in healthcare. I've been a physician for over almost 4 decades in low-income healthcare, caring for people with what we call in healthcare social determinants of health, which is a nice euphemism for some really difficult issues. I, like Dan, kind of reunited with my veterans identity after Trump was elected and we found ourselves at Standing Rock, and the need not to have a different voice than those who are wrapping themselves in the flag today and continuing the perpetual wars. But I wanted to talk about the intersect of what's happening here in Massachusetts with veterans, the kinds of conditions. We all know the obvious conditions, the wounds, the amputations, the head injury, but far more prevalent, of course, are the hidden conditions. And the hidden conditions really deal with horrific mental health issues, PTSD, memory, inability to reintegrate. And that inability doesn't just happen in the years after return, it happens for decades, in some cases for a lifetime after that. In the world that I have lived in inner city healthcare for all these decades, and at the intersect of Medicaid, and want to say a couple of things about that, there is not good data, and we need it. The percentage of veterans, the evidence suggests the percentage of veterans as a percentage of the homeless population of people that have severe persistent mental illness, that have significant substance use, significant inability to reintegrate, is much, much higher than their numbers in the community. And we actually need to understand those numbers, and I was listening to all the quantification in the last panel. Really, we can only talk qualitatively. The numbers are higher. We find veterans disproportionately represented. What are the issues? In the case of Dan and myself, I was in the last year or two of drafted. I was sent to Vietnam in 1969 as what they call the field physician with the 101st Airborne Division. And so we were not in a MASH hospital. We were sending them back to the MASH hospitals. And we all know the toll that took in that ward. And veterans were every much the victims, as was the Vietnamese society and actually the Vietnamese landscape. All were victimized in that war. And so many people in our generation never re-entered. And so what I really want to say at this point is let's look at the hidden wounds. We will find veterans disproportionately found in the homeless population, substance abuse and using and addiction population, and with various forms of severe mental illness that really impede function. And so what does that mean in terms of budgets? Well, first and foremost, Medicaid stands out as really the critical funder of services. And it was mentioned that yes, 30% of people in Massachusetts have Medicaid, but 90% of people with physical disabilities, developmental disabilities, severe persistent mental illness related disabilities, they absolutely rely on Medicaid. And I do want to say we are really fortunate in Massachusetts. We have one of the most progressive Medicaid, if not the most progressive Medicaid program of all states. There's only a handful of states, for example, in a Medicaid program that would pay for addiction treatments, you know, Suboxone and methadone maintenance and things like that for opiate addiction. Only, you can count them in a little more than one hand. Massachusetts was the first one to offer that, going back to the Dukakis years in the 1980s. The problem we have in terms of budgeting is resources on the ground. We have the benefits, other states don't have that. That's why I think we're doing better in terms of mortality than in the opiate addiction. But we don't have the treatment resources. There needs to be a crash program. And that is for the general population, but clearly if veterans are disproportionately represented, it's for that population as well. Secondly, and we can't talk about veterans without talking about the VA system. The VA system has been eviscerated in the last few years. There is approximately 40,000 unfilled clinical and administrative positions. Try to think about running a hospital system with large numbers of unfilled positions. And the VA itself is unique in terms of an ability to respond to the unique issues and traumas of people that are returning veterans. And we see essentially a backlog, a starving, and probably stealth privatization. On the private side, I can tell you I've lived it, I work it. In fact, I'm a hospitalist at Boston Medical Center. We don't have the skill set or the experience or the peer counseling or a whole series of other services that VAs have. That's a fact. And so any moral budget has to recognize, yes, that's federal, but we've got to fund that far more comprehensively. And then the rest of it falls, think about all the delivery system pieces that we need. Far more expansion of substance abuse treatment. Mental illness is an incredible problem today. I mean, we know our county jails are probably the mental health system for far more people than they should be. And so it is a hopelessly contracted system. And again, veterans disproportionately are a part of that. And so it's not just the veterans, it's obviously for all of us. And so when we look at Medicaid, when we look at funding for the delivery system and the clinicians and the programs, and when we look at the need for housing first, and that's a huge issue, there is no end to the need for that kind of investment. No end at all. I would ask people if you want to ride by and see the visual, they call it the mile, from Harrison Avenue down to Melnia Cass Boulevard at Boston Medical Center. It's almost biblical in terms of the human tragedy that's on the street, the mix of substance abuse, homelessness, and the like. Emma Lazarus, if she wrote about this population, would be as eloquent as she did about in the Colossus, about the refuse, the immigrants coming to the United States in the latter part of the 19th century. So I'll stop there. And one thing I would say in terms of policy, we really need to understand in hard numbers the numbers of veterans as a percentage in all of these other areas. Anecdotally and qualitatively, they're disproportionately there. We need to understand that more specifically quantitatively.
You all have to leave. Why don't we take a few questions right now if you could stay for a few minutes. Why don't we open the floor? Lisa.
You said that 40,000 unfilled positions in
in the VA system.
Like whose fault is that?
There was a freeze when the Trump administration took office in January of 2017, put a freeze on a whole series of areas in the federal government, and the VA was one of those. Now, some of that has been, there's been a release on the freeze, but the backlog is still, has never really been ameliorated.
Ruth?
When this president was running, a reporter asked him, if elected president, what would you do about Iraq? His response was, I'll bomb the hell out of them and take their oil. I want to understand, because I know veterans go to fight to protect humans in those places. But isn't this a lot of these wars to enhance the wealth of those people? And the other thing I want to ask you, have the Veteran Association thought about what is happening at the border with the children? Whenever a country does what we're doing, this is a country that goes and invades them. How come no one is talking about what's going on at the border here?
I'd just like to address the first one. After 9/11, a lot of people thought it was patriotic to join the service and protect the country. I, as a Vietnam veteran, was raised in a very conservative area of eastern Washington state. My parents were farm workers. And I joined thinking it was a patriotic thing to do. A lot of us get over there and find out that we've been lied to. Right? That we've been duped from the time we were in high school all the way through. We get over there and we see with our own eyes what the hell's happening, right? And we go, holy crap, right? And then we deal with that for the rest of our lives.
And
I'm the wife, by the way. I want to add something that I think got inadvertently left out, that the military is becoming more female, the percentages, and the unique needs of women in a traditionally patriarchal, you might say toxically masculine environment needs to be addressed in the health system, in the mental health system.
Absolutely.
And you know what I'm talking about, that needs to be heightened.
Absolutely.
I have a question. Is it true that there's a lot of like tension between the Army and the Navy and you know, like I'm a Navy person, you're in the Marines. Like, is there that? And does that affect?
There isn't joking,
Yeah.
right? You know, we joke a lot with the Marines as far as Bob and I are Army, about them being Marines. Standing Rock? There were 4,000 veterans out at Standing Rock, from active duty to a 93-year-old Marine from Saipan who told her, yeah, right, who said, I wasn't missing this for anything. So I told my wife she had to drive. She was 89. 4,000 of us out there and Republicans. Trump supporters were out there. And we all had a chance to just hang together. And there is nobody, it's called peer-to-peer. There's nobody that understands a veteran like another veteran, whether you be Navy, Coast Guard, Army, or Marine, whether you served active duty now, Vietnam, Korea, World War II, or Iraq, Afghanistan. You know, most of us know it's bullshit.
by the way, the saying up in Standing Rock is, finally, we're on the right side.
Right war, right side, and on the right side of oil for a change.
All right, we promised our colleagues here that they'd be able to leave in silence, you guys. Let me say that what you said is the draft for the veterans' needs piece of the moral budget. So we're gonna want your comments, and we'll clean them up and make them,
All right, there you go.
expository
Thank you, John.
prose. Right. Good luck at the demonstration.
Thank you.
Okay.